The chapel went quiet so fast that I could hear the tremble in my own breath. The lights above the altar hummed softly, as if they were the only things brave enough to speak. I stood beside my son, watching him smile at the woman he thought he knew. Lorelei leaned towards me, her veil brushing my sleeve, her perfume sharp in my throat. Her lips barely moved as she whispered the threat that split my heart in two. "Buy us a house, or I will lie and say I am pregnant with your child." My fingers closed around the small object in my pocket. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at her bright smile. 200 guests watched us, unaware that the woman in white had just promised to burn my life to the ground. My son, Cashin, never noticed the shift in her voice or the coldness in her eyes. She held his hand gently, but she dug her nails into my arm with a quiet warning. "I am Eldon Ward, 68 years old, and every year of hard work lives inside my bones. My hands carry the story of warehouse shifts, cold mornings, and heavy boxes lifted so my boy could have clean shoes and a warm meal. I raised him alone from the age of 10 after losing my wife. There had been no fancy dinners or expensive holidays, only late nights, microwave dinners, and quiet pride when he brought home good grades. Cashin was the proof that I had built something meaningful out of struggle. When I looked at him at the altar, I still saw the child who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. His jaw was sharper now, his posture confident, his eyes shining with love for Lorelei. He never saw the way her fingers tightened around my arm when she whispered her threat. He believed he was moments away from a perfect future. Every guest in the chapel believed the same. Only I knew that the young woman at his side had plans for my house, my savings, and my quiet old age. Memories from the past year rushed through my mind as I stared at her. Cashin had brought her to my home on a cool autumn evening. She had walked into my small apartment in a bright red coat, her smile sweet and her eyes restless. She laughed loudly at jokes I had told 100 times, touched my arm far too often, and asked questions about my house in a way that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore the feeling. I wanted to believe she cared about my son and nothing more. Hints turned into direct requests. She spoke to me over coffee about security and comfort, asking what I planned to do with my house when I grew older. She suggested that a newly married couple should not begin life in a small flat when a larger place was available. My refusal earned a tight smile and cold eyes. Her politeness thinned each week. I heard her on the balcony once, talking to a friend about getting me to sign everything over before I became too old to think clearly. I stood in the hallway with my heart sinking as I realized she saw me as a door she needed to unlock. I prepared quietly, partly out of fear and partly out of instinct. A lifetime of hardship had taught me to listen to my doubts. I bought a small recording device and learned how to use the speaker system at the chapel. I prayed I would never need any of it. I wanted to be wrong about her. I wanted my son to marry someone who would stand by him, not someone who wanted to push me aside the moment vows were exchanged. The final proof arrived just half an hour before the ceremony. Lorelei caught me alone in a small dressing room. Her makeup was perfect, her smile cold. She spoke in a low voice about rumors, about how easily a young woman's tears could destroy an old man's name. She said she would ruin me without hesitation if I refused to give them my house. Every word was recorded by the device in my pocket. I kept my face still and my voice quiet, but inside my chest something cracked. As I stood at the front of the chapel, her latest threat settled heavily in my mind. She believed I would remain silent to protect Cashin. She believed a man my age would accept humiliation rather than cause a scene. She believed I had nothing left to fight with. My hand moved slowly to my pocket as the pastor cleared his throat and prepared to continue the ceremony. Cashin frowned at me with confusion. Lorelei kept her smile fixed, but her eyes flickered with fear when she saw my calm expression. I stepped back from the couple and lifted my phone so everyone could see it. My voice shook slightly, but I spoke clearly. "Before this wedding continues, there is something the guests need to hear." I tapped the screen. The chapel speakers crackled. Lorelei's voice filled the room. Her own words echoed against the walls. "Buy us a house, or I will lie and say I am pregnant with your child." A wave of gasps filled the chapel as people turned towards us. Cashin's hand dropped from hers. Lorelei's smile collapsed. She let out a scream that stunned everyone into silence. My heart pounded as I looked at my son. He stared at me with shock, betrayal, confusion, and pain all mixed together. I felt my breath tighten as I waited for his next words. The next thing he said would change everything. The silence after Lorelai's scream felt heavier than any noise. I stood at the altar, phone still raised, heart pounding in my ears. Cashin stared at me as if he no longer recognized the man who had raised him. His jaw trembled slightly, and his eyes were locked on mine in a way that made my knees weaken. My son had always trusted me, yet in that moment he seemed caught between two worlds. One world held the woman he thought he loved. The other held the father who had shaped every year of his life. Guests whispered behind us, their voices rising and falling like waves. Lorelai clutched her dress and looked around as if the walls were closing in on her. My throat felt as dry as sand. I struggled to breathe as I waited for Cashin to speak. Cashin stepped towards Lorelai as if he wanted to protect her from the chaos. He looked down at her, searching her face for a truth he hoped existed. She refused to meet his eyes. Her hands shook so much that she dropped her bouquet. The flowers scattered across the marble floor. A few guests stood to get a better view. I felt the weight of the entire room pressing against my chest. When Cashin finally turned back to me, I braced myself for rejection. His voice cracked as he asked, "Dad, is that really her voice?" His question held fear rather than anger. I nodded slowly. There was no point in adding more words. The recording spoke clearly. Cashin pressed a hand to his forehead and took 2 long breaths before looking at Lorelai once more. She whispered something too faint to hear, and he stepped back from her as if the ground had shifted under his feet. My mind drifted to the years behind us. I remembered standing in the kitchen late at night, checking his homework while he slept with his head on the table. I remembered his first broken bone, his first school play, his first heartbreak in college. Each memory came back so sharply that I felt them like blows. I never imagined that parenthood would bring me to a day like this. My heart strained as I watched him fight the truth unfolding in front of him. Lorelai suddenly rushed forward and grabbed his arm. She begged him to listen, saying it was all a misunderstanding and that I had twisted her words. Her voice shook so much that even the pastor looked concerned. Cashin stared at her in disbelief. He asked why she would say such things about a pregnancy that did not exist. She had no answer that made sense. Security volunteers near the door began moving closer, unsure if they were needed. A few guests sat back down, others stood, and some recorded the scene with their phones. I lowered my own phone and slipped it into my pocket, then folded my hands in front of me. I kept my posture straight, even though my stomach churned. Cashin pulled his arm free from Lorelai's grip. He stepped towards me again, and the hurt in his face cut straight through me. "Why did she do this, Dad?" His voice trembled. I wanted to tell him that love can sometimes blind a person until truth arrives like a cold wind. I wanted to tell him that I had feared this moment for months and prepared only to protect him. Instead, I simply said, "She wanted my house. She wanted more than you could give her." He closed his eyes as if the truth stung deeply. Lorelai let out a low cry, then dropped to her knees on the steps of the altar. She covered her face with both hands. Cashin looked at her without speaking. His breathing grew unsteady. The pastor gently stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. One of the bridesmaids whispered something about stopping the ceremony before it fell apart completely. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. I never wished to embarrass Lorelai in this way, yet I could not allow her to destroy my life or my son's future. Cashin lifted his head and looked at the pastor. His voice was flat as he said that the wedding could not continue. The pastor nodded slowly and announced to the guests that the ceremony was ending. The crowd stirred with shock. Cashin walked down the steps and stood beside me. He did not speak at first. He stared forward with empty eyes, as if he could not believe that his future had collapsed in a single moment. I placed a hand on his back gently. He did not pull away. Lorelai remained on the floor, shaking, whispering to herself. Her family rushed to her, surrounding her like a shield. I turned away to give Cashin space to breathe. The chapel felt strangely cold. The air had changed. I could sense the beginning of something painful and necessary. Cashin finally asked me to walk outside with him. His voice was soft, almost childlike, as if he needed his father more than he wished to admit. I nodded and followed him towards the exit. Guests parted to let us through. I heard whispers, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some confused. Cashin pushed open the doors and stepped into the sunlight. He inhaled sharply as if he had been holding his breath for too long. I stood beside him, unsure of the right words. He rubbed his hands together, blinked several times, and looked at me. A small crack formed in his expression, a sign that he was fighting tears. I wanted to reach out and hold him the way I had when he was small, yet the years between us felt heavy. He finally spoke. "Dad, I need to know everything. All of it." His voice was firm this time. I saw a spark of strength returning to him. That spark had lived inside him since childhood. It had carried him through difficult years. I knew that this moment could shape the man he would become. I nodded again and opened my mouth to speak. Before I could answer, the chapel doors swung open behind us. Lorelei rushed out, her veil torn, her face streaked with running makeup. She shouted his name through sobs. Cashin froze. My heart tightened because I knew her next words could twist everything once more. Her scream echoed across the courtyard as she started running towards us. The look in her eyes made the hairs on my arms rise. I sensed that something darker was brewing inside her. Cashin turned slowly, and I could see the conflict in his face. I stood still, waiting to see which truth would survive the moment that was coming. Lorelei's footsteps scraped against the courtyard stone as she sprinted toward us. Her veil dragged behind her like a torn cloud, and her eyes looked wild enough to frighten a crowd. Cashin stepped back, startled by the intensity in her voice. My own pulse tightened because I recognized the look in her eyes. A person cornered by truth can turn desperate in ways that defy logic. I braced myself, unsure of what she might do. Her sobs echoed against the church walls as she reached us. She grabbed Cashin's jacket with shaking hands and begged him not to leave her. She tried to pull him close, insisting that the recording had been twisted, insisting that she loved him more than her own life. Her voice cracked and shook in a way that made some of the guests gather at the doorway to watch. Cashin struggled to steady himself. His hands hovered uncertainly before he gently pried her fingers from his jacket. His voice was quiet as he asked her to let go. She shook her head violently, tears splashing across her cheeks. I felt a knot form in my chest. There was a part of me that pitted her despite everything. Desperation had taken control of her, and that kind of panic often leads to foolish choices. Cashin told her he needed space to think. She stared at him with a look that mixed shock and disbelief, almost as if she had expected him to defend her even after hearing her own words in front of 200 people. She reached out to him again, but this time he stepped behind me, as if my presence could shield him from the chaos. Her expression changed slowly. Tears continued to fall, yet her voice dropped into a lower, calmer tone. She said she had been under pressure, that she had spoken foolishly in a moment of stress. She told him she had never meant to hurt either of us, that she had dreamed of a beautiful wedding and a peaceful future. Cashin stared at the ground, unable to look at her. He asked her why she spoke about ruining my life if she never meant it. She gave no answer. Her eyes flicked between us as she searched for a story that could erase what had already happened. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of her own silence. A car door slammed across the street. Her mother stormed out, anger sharp in her stride. She marched toward us with her voice already raised. She claimed the recording was a misunderstanding and accused me of manipulating her daughter. She did not care that 50 guests stood at the entrance, listening. She pointed a finger at me, saying I had probably provoked the whole thing to embarrass their family. Cashin lifted his head, and a cold, steady expression appeared on his face. He told her mother to stop talking. His tone was firm enough to silence the courtyard for several moments. I watched him as he spoke. His shoulders straightened. His eyes cleared. He looked like the man I always believed he could be. He said that he had heard the words from Lorelei's own mouth and did not need anyone to explain them away. Lorelei's mother opened her mouth to argue again, but Cashin raised a hand. He said the wedding was canceled. His voice did not shake. Her mother covered her mouth, shocked into stillness. Lorelei let out a small cry and collapsed onto the steps leading back to the chapel. Her arms wrapped around her knees as she rocked slightly. The scene felt heavy with pain that none of us knew how to soothe. Guests began drifting away slowly. Some walked backward as they left, unwilling to turn their backs on the drama unfolding before them. Cashin's friends approached him quietly to check if he was all right. He nodded to each one without speaking. His mind was elsewhere. I stood close enough to feel the heat of his distress. My own heart ached for the boy I raised, the man who now stood in the ruins of a future he had built in his mind. He placed a hand on my arm and asked me to walk with him. We crossed the parking area in silence. The sky hung heavy, gray with the promise of rain, as if the weather itself felt the weight of what had happened. Cashin reached the far end of the lot, away from curious eyes, and leaned against a tree. He held his face in both hands and breathed deeply. I waited. I knew he needed time to gather his thoughts. He finally dropped his hands and looked at me with red eyes. He said he felt ashamed that he had not seen the signs. I told him that love often blinds the honest before it blinds the deceitful. He exhaled slowly and told me he needed me to tell him everything that happened between Lorelei and me. I described each conversation, each hint, each visit to my home where she pressed me about the house. I told him about overhearing her on the balcony, about her demands in the dressing room, about the recording that captured her threats. He listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened at certain moments, and his eyes narrowed at others. He asked why I had not told him earlier. I admitted that I did not want to break his heart unless I had undeniable proof. He frowned, but his voice softened as he said he understood. Trust between us had been shaken by the situation, yet I sensed that it could rebuild itself if we moved with honesty. He walked a few steps away, running a hand through his hair. He looked lost in thought. A gust of cold wind swept through the lot, carrying the faint sound of Lorelei's sobs from the chapel entrance. Cashin turned slightly to listen, then faced me again. He said he could not stay there any longer. He needed space from everyone, including her family. I nodded and told him I would drive him home. He agreed without hesitation. His shoulders slumped as if exhaustion had finally reached him. We drove in silence along the quiet streets. The traffic lights glowed softly against the windows. The city seemed unusually still, as if aware of our sorrow. Cashin stared straight ahead with an unreadable expression. I wanted to comfort him. I wanted to tell him that life often rebuilds itself after the harshest storms. I stayed quiet because I sensed that words would only weigh him down further in that moment. He broke the silence halfway home. His voice was rough as he said he felt foolish. I told him he was not foolish, only trusting. He glanced at me and admitted that he should have listened more closely when I tried to warn him in small ways. I assured him that nothing mattered more than his safety and clarity now. He pressed his lips together and nodded slowly. We returned to the apartment without speaking again. He walked inside and sank onto the sofa. I sat across from him, watching him stare into the distance. A quiet settled between us, yet it did not feel hostile. It felt like a space where truth could finally breathe. Cashin eventually whispered that he felt something deeper than heartbreak. He felt betrayed in a way that shook his foundation. I understood that pain well. I told him that betrayal often comes disguised as affection until the moment truth forces its mask away. He nodded, absorbing each word like a man trying to rebuild himself piece by piece. A soft knock sounded at the apartment door. Cashin looked at me with worry. I stood slowly and approached the door with caution. The sound of a woman's voice drifted through the wood. Lorelei's voice. She had followed us home. Cashin stood from the sofa, eyes wide with disbelief. My hand hovered above the doorknob. I felt my pulse drum inside my ears as the knocking grew stronger. Cashin whispered my name, voice tight with fear and anger. I took a breath and prepared myself. The moment felt like the edge of a cliff. The next choice could change the entire direction of our lives. The knocking grew louder, each strike carrying a strain of panic. I stood at the door with my hand resting on the cool metal of the lock, feeling the weight of the moment settle across my shoulders. Cashin stood behind me, tense as a drawn bowstring. His breath came sharp and quick. Lorelei's voice trembled through the wood as she begged us to let her in. I felt the urge to protect my son rise in my chest like a tide. My instincts warned me that opening the door could pull us into another storm. Her tone shifted between pleading and demanding in a way that unsettled the air. I placed a hand against the doorframe and braced myself. Cashin whispered that he did not want to see her. His voice shook slightly, yet he stood tall. I told him he did not need to face her if he was not ready. He nodded and stepped back, moving to the hallway that led towards his room. His expression showed both exhaustion and fear, a combination I had seen only once before when he was a child lost in a shopping mall. I turned my attention to the door again. Lorelei called his name repeatedly, each time sounding more frantic. Her cries echoed across the corridor outside. I unlocked the door just enough to create a narrow gap. Lorelei stood in the hallway with her makeup streaked down her cheeks and her dress torn at the hem where she had tripped earlier. She looked almost unrecognizable from the woman who had walked down the aisle with such confidence. She reached for the door immediately, but I kept my foot braced to hold it steady. She told me she needed to speak with Cashin. Her hands shook violently as she pleaded with me. She insisted that she had acted out of fear and that the recording had captured a moment of foolishness rather than a true intention. Her eyes darted past me, searching for any sign of my son. I stepped outside and pulled the door nearly closed behind me. I told her that Cashin needed time to process everything that had happened. Her face twisted with frustration. Tears pooled again as she said she could not go home with her family. She claimed that her mother blamed her for the entire disaster and had yelled at her in the car. She said she felt trapped and needed Cashin to give her another chance. I kept my voice calm as I reminded her that the decision belonged to him. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. She said she understood that I had never liked her and believed that I was trying to keep Cashin away from her. Her accusation stung despite everything. I told her that I had not tried to come between them until she threatened my life and reputation. Her expression shifted from anger to shame. She sank against the wall and buried her face in her hands. Her sobs echoed down the hall and made my chest tighten. I never liked seeing young people break under the weight of their own actions. Cashin's voice drifted through the crack of the door behind me. He asked if she was still there. I told him she was. He asked me not to let her in. His voice carried a finality that surprised me. I stepped away from Lorelei and closed the door firmly. She cried out, begging me not to shut her out, begging Cashin to listen. Her voice grew louder, and I knew the neighbors would soon open their doors to investigate. I leaned my forehead against the doorframe. Cashin stared at me with tired eyes from the end of the corridor. I told him she would eventually leave. He nodded, then walked back to the sofa and sat heavily. His shoulders slumped as if all the air had been pressed out of him. Outside, Lorelei continued to cry and knock for several minutes. Her voice grew hoarse. Eventually, the sound faded as she walked away down the hallway. The apartment fell quiet again. The silence felt almost fragile. Cashin leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. His hands trembled slightly. I sat down beside him and waited. He turned his head and looked at me with an expression that held both sorrow and understanding. He whispered that he needed me now more than ever. My chest tightened with emotion, yet I stayed controlled because I knew he needed strength rather than sentiment. I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that he would not face this alone. He nodded slowly, leaning into the reassurance. Hours passed in a kind of stillness that allowed us both to breathe again. The sun slipped behind the buildings outside, leaving a soft blue glow in the room. Cashin finally stood and walked into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. He stared at the counter for a long moment before speaking. He said he felt embarrassed that he had allowed Lorelei such influence. I reminded him that people often trust deeply when they want a future to work. There is no shame in wanting love. He turned to face me and admitted that Lorelei had isolated him from many of his friends during the engagement. She had convinced him that they were jealous of their relationship. I felt a small jolt at the realization that her control had stretched further than I knew. He leaned against the counter, looking thoughtful. He said he wanted to start rebuilding his life, even though he did not know where to begin. I told him that recovery often starts with small steps. He nodded and took a seat across from me at the table. The same table where I had once helped him with school projects and tax forms. The same table where life had felt simple, even during difficult years. He folded his hands and stared down at them. He said he felt empty in a way he had never felt before. I assured him that emptiness can become space for something better in time. The sound of another knock startled us both. Cashin flinched, and I felt my heart jump. I rose slowly and approached the door with caution. A slip of paper had been slid under the door. Cashin approached and picked it up before I could. His eyes scanned it, and a frown formed on his face. He handed it to me silently. The note was written in hurried handwriting. Lorelei had left it. Her message said she would not give up on repairing the relationship and that she would prove she still loved him. She promised she would come back the next day. Cashin closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy breath. He asked me what we should do. I sensed the mixture of fear and exhaustion in his voice. I folded the note and placed it on the table. I told him we would face whatever came next together. His shoulders relaxed slightly. He asked if he could stay with me for a few days. The request carried the weight of a child seeking shelter from a storm. I agreed immediately. His relief showed in the way he exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath since the ceremony. The night stretched on quietly. Cashin eventually went to his room and closed the door softly. I remained at the table for a long while, listening to the silence. My mind drifted to the dangers that lingered when a person like Lorelei refused to let go of something broken. I sensed that she was not finished. I sensed that the next few days would test both of us in ways we had not expected. A cold wind tapped against the window. The apartment felt smaller than usual. I sat there with the folded note in my hand, wondering what her next move would be. Cashin slept fitfully in the next room. I could feel the storm gathering again, waiting for dawn. Morning arrived with a pale light that crept across the floor. I barely slept because my mind stayed alert throughout the night. Cashin emerged from his room with tired eyes and a stiffness in his posture. He asked if Lorelei had returned. I told him the hallway had remained quiet. His shoulders dropped with relief, yet worry still clung to him. He made coffee in silence, staring at the kitchen tiles as if trying to ground himself in something steady. I watched him quietly and felt a small ache in my chest. My son had entered adulthood with hope, only to be thrown into a storm that stole his peace in a single afternoon. He sat across from me with his coffee cupped in both hands. He asked if he had been blind to Lorelei's behavior. I shook my head and told him that deceit often wears charm as its disguise. He nodded slowly, absorbing the words. There was a quiet maturity in his eyes, as though pain had carved a space for growth. I sensed that this moment could help him rebuild himself in ways that would last. I reminded him that he had shown great strength when he said no to her manipulation at the chapel. His expression softened. A small part of him needed that reassurance. A knock sounded at the door before either of us could move from our seats. Cashin tensed immediately. My spine stiffened as well. I approached the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. A police officer stood on the other side. His presence startled me. I opened the door slowly and greeted him with a polite nod. He asked if we knew a woman named Lorelei Bracken. Cashin appeared beside me with wide eyes. The officer explained that she had been found sitting on a bench outside the chapel early that morning, shaking and nearly unresponsive. A concerned passerby had called for help. She had refused medical attention and insisted she needed to speak with us. The officer said she had left the area after a short conversation with him. His tone held a hint of concern. Cashin swayed slightly as he processed the information. I thanked the officer for letting us know. He left after advising us to call if she attempted to approach aggressively. Cashin shut the door gently and leaned against it. His breathing grew uneven. I guided him back to the kitchen table and sat him down. He wiped his face with his hands and whispered that he did not want this to spiral further. I assured him that we would handle things carefully. His eyes glistened, though he kept his voice steady. He said he felt responsible for her decline. I told him that every person chooses their own actions, and he had not created her behavior. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains as the day moved forward. Cashin rested in the living room while I fixed a simple meal in the kitchen. I caught sight of movement outside the window. A small shadow shifted near the car park. My heart thudded painfully. I stepped closer and lifted the curtain slightly. Lorelei stood beside a lamppost, arms wrapped around herself. Her dress had been replaced with casual clothes, but her posture looked fragile. She stared up at the building as if unsure whether to approach. I let the curtain fall slowly. Cashin walked into the kitchen and asked what I had seen. I told him the truth gently. His breath hitched. His hands trembled again. He asked why she could not let him go. I told him that some people cling to the idea of a future even after the truth has shattered it. He swallowed hard and looked toward the window. He asked me what he should do. I reminded him that his safety mattered above all else. He nodded and stepped back, as if he wanted to retreat into the shadows of the room. My own heart softened because I knew how heavy this must feel for him. I approached the window again, careful not to let my silhouette appear too clearly. Lorelei remained outside, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She looked exhausted and lost. Cashin took a seat at the table and whispered that he needed boundaries. I agreed. He said he could not speak to her until he regained his sense of stability. He also said he did not wish harm on her. That showed his character clearly. Pain had not hardened him. It had shaped him. I placed a hand on his arm and reminded him that compassion did not require self-destruction. He nodded and took a deep breath. The room felt warmer with the afternoon light, yet the tension remained. Hours passed, and Lorelei did not leave the area. Her presence sat like a weight outside the building. Cashin grew restless. His hands kept moving to his hair, his collar, the edge of the sofa. I suggested we take a short walk to clear our minds. He agreed reluctantly. We left the apartment through the back stairwell. The air outside felt crisp and cool. Cashin took long breaths, letting the wind clear his thoughts. We walked down the street slowly. People passed us without noticing the heaviness that followed each step. Cashin eventually stopped near a small park bench and sat down. I sat beside him, giving him space. He asked what would have happened if I had not recorded the conversation at the chapel. I felt the question settle deep inside me. I told him that truth can be fragile when someone determined to cause harm controls the story. His jaw tightened. He said he did not know how he could ever trust someone again after this. I reminded him that trust grows slowly after betrayal, yet it grows stronger when rebuilt carefully. He stared at the grass beneath his feet and nodded. We returned home as evening approached. I checked the front from a safe angle before opening the door. Lorelei had finally left. Cashin let out a sigh of relief. He walked inside and sank into the sofa again. The apartment felt strangely quiet. I locked the door and sat beside him. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked if things would return to normal. I told him that life often finds its balance again after a storm. He leaned against the cushion and closed his eyes, letting the comfort settle into him. A faint vibration came from his phone on the table. He frowned when he picked it up. A new message had arrived from an unknown number. His eyes scanned the screen. His face drained of color. He handed me the phone silently. The message contained only a few words. Lorelei had written that she had discovered something that would change everything. Her message warned that she was coming back. The screen dimmed, leaving a tense silence that filled the apartment like a rising tide. Night settled quietly around the apartment, yet my chest felt heavy with dread. Cashin sat frozen on the sofa with the phone still in his hand. His eyes looked hollow as he tried to process the message. He whispered that Lorelei must have found a new way to pull him back into her world. I lowered myself into the chair opposite him and asked him to breathe slowly. His breath came sharp at first, then steadier as he focused on the rhythm. The room felt colder, as if the air had thinned. Cashin placed the phone on the coffee table with trembling fingers. He asked me what she meant by discovering something that would change everything. I had no answer, only a growing unease inside my stomach. I stood and walked to the window. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement outside. My reflection stared back at me, lined with age and worry. I listened carefully for any sound that might signal her return. Cars passed occasionally, and a group of students laughed as they crossed the road. Nothing seemed out of place. Cashin joined me at the window, his shoulder brushing mine lightly. He asked if he should block the number. I advised him to keep it open until we understood what she planned. He nodded reluctantly. His face carried that old mixture of fear and responsibility, the same expression he had worn as a child when he thought he had done something wrong. He returned to the sofa and rubbed his eyes. He said he felt as if Lorelei was slipping through cracks in every wall, every door, every quiet moment. I told him that this feeling would pass. He whispered that he was not sure he believed that. I sat beside him and reminded him that truth always finds its place. She could not twist it forever. He took a deep breath and leaned back. He closed his eyes and let the silence settle over him. I stayed beside him, watching the shadows move across the room as the night deepened. The phone buzzed again. Cashin sat upright immediately. His hands shook as he lifted it from the table. Another message glowed on the screen. She had written that she needed to speak with him in person and that she could not leave things undone. Cashin sank back against the cushion. He whispered that he could not take another confrontation. His voice cracked at the edges. I told him he did not need to see her. I assured him that he had the right to protect himself. He looked at me with gratitude in his eyes. He asked if I would handle the situation if she appeared again. I promised him that I would. I took the phone gently from his hands and placed it on the shelf across the room. I wanted to create distance between him and whatever words might come next. He nodded and folded his arms across his chest, trying to calm himself. I walked into the kitchen to make tea. The familiar routine helped steady my own nerves. The kettle hummed quietly while I prepared 2 cups. Cashin joined me after a few minutes. His steps were slow, as if each movement required thought. He took the cup I offered and held it close to his chest. Steam rose softly between us as we stood at the counter. Cashin asked what might drive her to this level of desperation. I explained that some people cannot accept that their plans have collapsed, so they cling to whatever pieces remain. He stared into the tea, lost in his own thoughts. He whispered that he had believed she genuinely loved him. I reminded him that love does not demand the destruction of someone else's life. His shoulders slumped. He looked older in that moment, as if the day had carved new lines into his face. We took our tea to the living room and sat in silence. The clock on the wall ticked softly. A gust of wind rattled the window. Cashin stared at the blank television screen. I watched the tension in his jaw tighten each time he thought about the situation. Eventually, he asked if Lorelei might be capable of something dangerous. I answered honestly. I told him that desperation combined with pride can push people toward reckless choices. His eyes widened slightly. I placed a hand on his arm and reassured him that he would be protected. Hours passed slowly. Cashin drifted to sleep on the sofa. His breathing became gentle and steady. I covered him with a blanket and lowered the lights. My own body felt heavy with exhaustion, yet my mind refused to settle. I returned to the window again, checking the street for any sign of her. The night stayed quiet. The air held the kind of stillness that unsettles rather than soothes. I kept watch until my eyes stung with tiredness. Eventually, I rested in the chair beside the sofa, letting my body relax while my thoughts remained alert. A sharp sound jolted me awake. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. Cashin stirred but did not wake. I listened closely. The sound repeated faintly. It came from the stairwell just outside the apartment door. I rose quietly and approached the door with careful steps. My hand hovered above the peephole. I looked through it slowly. A shadow moved on the other side. The corridor light flickered, casting an uneven glow. I could not see her face clearly, yet I recognized the posture. Lorelei stood with her head lowered and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She whispered something too soft to understand. My pulse quickened. I turned the lock as silently as possible to ensure the door stayed secure. Her voice grew slightly louder as she called Cashin's name. I remained silent, hoping she would leave. She continued whispering to herself, pacing in front of the door. Each step echoed through the corridor. The sound carried a strange rhythm, as if she walked without awareness. I glanced back at Cashin. He slept peacefully, unaware of the unease outside. Lorelei eventually stopped pacing and bent down. She slid another folded note under the door. The paper scraped softly against the floor. She stood still for several seconds, then walked away down the stairs. The silence that followed felt thick and uneasy. I waited a moment before picking up the note. I opened it carefully. Her handwriting looked shakier this time. She had written that she had found something in her family files that involved Cashin's mother. My breath caught in my throat as I read the last line. She claimed that this discovery explained everything about her behavior. I folded the note slowly. My hands trembled as I returned to the living room. Cashin still slept, unaware of the message that waited for him. I sat down beside him and held the note in my hand. My mind raced with old memories, old wounds and names I had not spoken in years. The past reached out from the shadows and pulled at me with unsettling force. I stared at the folded paper and felt the ground shift beneath my thoughts. Cashin stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. I looked at him and knew the truth inside that note could shatter him in ways he was not prepared to face. The night held its breath as I realized that the storm ahead was not only Lorelei. It was history. It was secrets. It was the one part of my past I had never wanted my son to confront. Dawn crept in slowly as pale stripes of light slipped across the carpet. I had not slept at all. Cashin still rested on the sofa, unaware of the note that lay folded in my hand. My mind circled the same old memories again and again. The mention of his mother had pulled me into a place I had not visited in decades. I stared at the paper as if it held a fire that could burn through the quiet I had built around my past. Cashin shifted slightly, his arms sliding down from the cushion. He opened his eyes, blinking away sleep. His gaze moved to my face, and something in my expression made him sit upright. He asked what had happened. I placed the note on the coffee table between us with a slow, deliberate motion. He stared at it for several seconds, then looked up at me. He asked if Lorelei had come back again. I nodded. He exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. He reached for the note with a hesitation that tightened my chest. He unfolded the paper carefully and scanned it. His eyebrows rose as his eyes widened. He read the lines aloud, his voice shaking slightly. Lorelei claimed that she had found old documents involving his mother, suggesting that his family history contained something she believed explained her behavior. He stared at the note for a long moment. Confusion and fear clouded his expression. He asked me what she meant. I sat back slowly, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on my shoulders. The truth settled heavily in my throat. I told him that there were parts of his mother's past that I had chosen to protect him from. He leaned forward, waiting for more. His eyes held a mixture of shock and longing. He asked why I had never mentioned anything. I explained that she had always been a sensitive subject. Cashin pressed a hand against his chest and whispered that he needed to understand what Lorelei might have found. I closed my eyes briefly. Memories rose with a clarity that unsettled me. I opened my eyes and faced him fully. I told him that before his mother met me, she had been engaged to another man. Their relationship had ended because he had fallen into heavy debt and attempted to draw her into it. She left him and started a new life, yet he never let go of her in his mind. I explained that this man had attempted several times to contact her after our marriage. Cashin listened intently, his breath growing shallow. I told him that when she passed away, I had found letters hidden in a drawer, letters from that man written with a desperation that frightened me. I kept them from Cashin to protect him from unnecessary pain. His mouth hung open slightly. He whispered that he never imagined such a past existed. His hands trembled as he placed the note back on the table. He asked if Lorelei knew any of this. I told him there was no reason she would have known. He asked why she would say she found something involving his mother. I felt a cold drop of dread settle in my stomach. I stood and walked to the window, staring down at the street. Morning light reflected against passing cars. The world moved normally, unaware of the storm brewing inside our walls. I told Cashin that it was possible someone from Lorelei's family had stumbled upon something old, perhaps through gossip or old connections. He frowned deeply. He asked why this information would explain her behavior. A chill crawled along my spine. I told him that secrecy attracts fear. People who discover something they do not fully understand can twist it into dangerous conclusions. Cashin rubbed his temples as if trying to massage clarity into his thoughts. He asked if the man from the letters was still alive. My heart sank. I admitted that I did not know. The years had passed quietly, and the trail had gone cold. Cashin asked if his mother had ever mentioned him. I shook my head. She had wanted a peaceful life with her family. He whispered that he wished he had known her better. His voice cracked slightly at the end. The air in the room thickened with emotion. Cashin stood and paced slowly, hands clasped behind his head. He said he felt overwhelmed. The betrayal from Lorelei had already shaken him, and now the suggestion of secrets within our own family history pulled him into a deeper confusion. I stepped closer and reminded him that truth from the past did not change who his mother had been or the love she had given him. He stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes that held both pain and trust. He asked me if I believed that Lorelei had some real discovery or if she was using this as another tactic. I told him that her behavior had shown a pattern of manipulation. It was possible she had found something insignificant and shaped it into something dramatic. He nodded but did not look convinced. The note had shaken him in ways I could see clearly. His mother had always been a tender place in his heart. Any mention of her opened a door he rarely touched. He asked if I still had the letters from her old fiancé. I nodded. He asked if he could see them. The request cut deeply, yet I understood its importance. I told him where they were stored. His eyes softened with gratitude. I walked into my room and opened a locked drawer beneath the bed. The letters sat inside a small wooden box. I carried the box into the living room and placed it gently on the table. Cashin stared at it, as if it held the shape of his mother's shadow. He opened the lid slowly. The letters inside had yellowed with age. He picked one up carefully, unfolding the fragile paper. His eyes scanned the handwritten lines. Emotion rippled across his face. I sat quietly as he read through each piece of the past. Tears glimmered in his eyes as he placed the letters back in the box. He whispered that he felt as though he was meeting a part of his mother he never knew. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. He leaned into the comfort. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The weight of the past rested between us like a quiet presence. The sound of another notification startled us both. Cashin grabbed his phone quickly. Another message from the unknown number. He opened it with shaking hands. His face went pale. He handed me the phone without speaking. The message said she had spoken with someone from her father's past who claimed to know the man who had written the letters. She said she would reveal everything in person. She wrote that she was already on her way. Cashin whispered my name. His voice trembled. I stared at the screen as a heavy stillness filled the room. The truth we were about to face no longer belonged only to Lorelei. The past had reached forward, uninvited, and placed its hand on our door. The knock arrived with a force that made the picture frames tremble on the wall. Cashin and I froze at the same moment. He clutched the edge of the sofa with both hands. The room felt smaller than it had ever felt. My heartbeat pressed against my ribs like a drum in a tight room. I rose slowly and approached the door. Cashin asked me not to open it. His voice carried fear and exhaustion in equal measure. I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that the truth would not go away by hiding. He nodded reluctantly and stood beside me. The knocking came again, softer this time, but urgent enough to unsettle the air. I looked through the peephole. Lorelei stood with her hair uncombed and her clothes wrinkled. She held a folder close to her chest. Her posture looked strained. She seemed less like the woman who had threatened me at the altar and more like someone who had lost her way entirely. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to speak. Her eyes flicked from me to Cashin immediately. She whispered that she needed 5 minutes. Cashin stepped back as if her presence pushed the air toward him. He whispered that he did not trust her. I nodded and told her she could speak in the hallway. She shook her head and insisted that Cashin needed to hear what she had found. Her voice trembled, yet not with manipulation this time. It carried a raw edge that felt unfamiliar. Cashin stepped forward slowly. He told her he would listen only if she behaved peacefully. She nodded quickly. Her eyes glimmered with a strange mixture of fear and remorse. I opened the door fully and allowed her to enter. She stood in the center of the room, clutching the folder with trembling hands. The air thickened with tension. Cashin crossed his arms tightly and waited. Lorelei took a slow breath before speaking. She said she had gone through her father's old storage boxes the previous night after the wedding collapsed. She explained that her father had once known a man who claimed to have a complicated past with a woman named Marlene Ward, Cashin's mother. Cashin flinched slightly at the sound of his mother's name. Lorelei opened the folder and placed several folded papers on the table. She stepped back to give us space. Cashin and I moved forward cautiously. The documents looked old, some worn at the edges. Lorelei explained that her father had mentioned meeting a man many years ago who had carried letters addressed to Marlene. She said she believed this was connected to the letters I had stored away. Cashin examined the papers while Lorelei continued. She said the man had claimed that Marlene had helped him financially during a difficult time and that he had intended to repay her. Cashin raised a confused eyebrow. Lorelei added that this man had believed Marlene intended to help him rebuild his life before they separated. I felt my stomach tighten at her words. She looked at me directly, as though waiting for explanation. I told them both the truth. After Marlene left her fiancé, she had still felt guilt over the debts he carried. She had tried to help him repay some of his obligations from a distance because she feared what would happen if she did nothing. She had not wanted him in her life, yet she could not let him fall apart entirely. I had only discovered this through her old journals, which I had kept hidden. Cashin looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. He whispered that she had been kinder than most people. I nodded. He reached out and touched the papers on the table with gentle fingers, as though they were fragile pieces of her spirit. Lorelei took a step forward and spoke quietly. She said she had reacted with fear when she discovered that her father had known the man from Marlene's past. She admitted that she had assumed the worst, believing there were hidden secrets in our family that might affect her future with Cashin. Her assumptions grew into suspicion, which then evolved into desperate behavior. She said she had felt threatened by the idea that Cashin's past held shadows she could not understand or control. Cashin stared at her with disbelief. She lowered her eyes. She admitted that her fear had not justified her actions. She apologized to him and to me. Her voice cracked under the weight of the words. Cashin stepped back and rubbed his hands together, trying to steady himself. He asked her why she had turned that fear into cruelty. She placed a hand on her chest and said she had panicked. She believed she might lose him if she did not secure her future through possession and control. She admitted that she had turned her own insecurity into pressure, demands, and threats. Her confession did not erase the pain she caused, yet it revealed the chaos inside her mind. She looked at Cashin with eyes full of regret. She whispered that she had loved him in her own misguided way. Cashin's shoulders sank. The truth finally settled over him like a heavy fog lifting from the ground. He told her that he accepted her apology, but could not rebuild something broken so deeply. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. She looked at me and apologized for her cruelty, her assumptions, and her threats. She said she had allowed fear to twist her into someone she did not recognize. I accepted her apology, not out of affection, but out of a quiet understanding of human weakness. Cashin gathered the papers and placed them neatly in the folder before handing it back to her. He told her that she needed to focus on healing and rebuilding her own life, separate from his. Her voice quivered as she agreed. She walked toward the door slowly, glancing back once with sorrow in her eyes. Cashin remained still until the door closed behind her. He exhaled deeply, placing both hands on his knees. The room felt strangely calm after her departure. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me with an expression that carried both sadness and relief. He said he felt as if his heart had been squeezed and released all in one breath. I nodded, understanding completely. He whispered that he wanted to rebuild his life with a clearer mind and a stronger foundation. I told him that he had already taken the first step by facing the truth instead of running from it. We sat together in quiet reflection. Sunlight filled the room, warming the walls that had witnessed fear, anger, and revelation. Cashin leaned back and closed his eyes. A gentle peace began to settle in his posture. I watched him and felt a tenderness rise in me. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence filled not with emptiness, but with possibility. Cashin opened his eyes slowly. He told me that he felt stronger, wiser, and grateful. I nodded. The truth had not destroyed him. It had shaped him. His future looked clearer now than it had in months. The day outside brightened as though the world itself acknowledged the new beginning taking shape within our home. If this story held your heart until the final moment, like, share, and join my channel where more powerful dramas await. Each story will draw you into the quiet battles people fight behind closed doors and the victories that rise from unexpected places. Subscribe and stay close, because the next story may speak to a part of your life that you have never shared aloud.